This is one of the most important graphs in the entire world. It shows the number of countries which are becoming either more or less democratic at any given time. You see this massive explosion of democracy at the end of World War II, and then in the 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union. But then something strange happens. You can see around the mid-2000s a massive spike in autocratizing countries. Or look at this other graph, which shows that over the last decade and a half, more and more democracies have declined into autocracies. The world is changing fast, and it's called democratic backsliding. This has been on my mind for a long time now, trying to understand it, writing about it, and I'm not the only one. This theme of democratic collapse has been showing up in fiction all over as we grapple with this. We're in the midst of a cyberpunk renaissance with stories like 2077, 36 Streets, Mushroom Blues, Cloudpunk, even Disco Elysium and other stories like The Infinite State or Andor or The Handmaid's Tale, which all delve into decaying institutions, bloated corporations, fractured resistance, and the rising tide of authoritarianism as democracy dies. But if we're going to write and create worlds to explore what's happening, then let's understand it. I want to talk about it from a world-building perspective, from what I've learned. Democracy and human rights often die first in the minds of voters before authoritarianism can take root as policy, as tactics of government. Imagine a stable, liberal democracy called Momolopolis. It has its issues, but it's fundamentally okay. Authoritarian policies just aren't that popular until several wars break out in the countries around Momolopolis, sparking a consistent economic decline, homelessness, and growing ethnic tensions over a decade. It's only here that you, an upstart authoritarian, can sell your policies to a disaffected electorate, and you finally win a seat. It's just the start. This is because authoritarians will often start by asking one simple question. If democracy and human rights and civil liberties brought you to this, then what's the point? If they aren't protecting what you value most, your children, your safety, your values, your culture, your law and order, your country, then what purpose do they really serve? They may not even say this explicitly, but it's the consequence of their policies. I was sitting in a car with a man from El Salvador just a few days ago, and I asked him about Nayib Bukele, the self-styled, quote, world's coolest dictator of El Salvador. Bukele is cracking down violently on El Salvadorian gangs, which are a real problem in the country, but at the same time, he has extended presidential limits, eroded protections from police seizure, undermined due process, and virtually purged the courts of any independence. I asked him about all of this, and he laughed, really. He laughed and he said, well, none of that really matters because at least he's dealing with the gangs. It was strange for me to hear this, someone who has, valued democracy and civil liberties like so much as a core value for my entire life, because he was nice. He wasn't bitter, he didn't come across as evil, but he was largely apathetic towards democracy as a system to solve problems. Authoritarians invoke a savior narrative, painting themselves as the lesser evil in the face of a terrible crisis, often the brave ones who are making the hard decisions, and anyone who's questioning them are just being naive. Or worse, they're on the side of those destroying the country. They paint themselves, or even you, as the victims. And a lot of this crisis is often genuine in a sense, like El Salvador genuinely does have a real gang problem or economic hardship. I don't think it's any coincidence that these jumps and falls line up with the 2008 financial crisis and the pandemic. Gilead in The Handmaid's Tale rises out of a fertility crisis where people are no longer having children, a rhetorical point we actually see showing up in a lot of modern authoritarian movements today around the birth rate, with this fear that we're going to lose our culture because women aren't having enough children. The cyberpunk genre almost always rises out of environmental collapse or civil war or huge economic decline, which sees the middle class decimated and corporations weaponizing the conflict to consolidate power with the promise of stability, and the government increasingly relying on them. They don't have to outright say it, but dismantling the democratic system and the laws protecting civil rights become one and the same with fixing the problem, which is why—
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
Consider what kind of crisis your democratic government would struggle to respond to and how that changes the value environment over time. Andor was such a fascinating story for me, in part because of the spotlight it gives not to the powerful authoritarian politicians who are making all of the policy decisions, like Palpatine and Vader. In fact, they are never seen, rarely ever mentioned. Instead, the story focuses on how ordinary people get swept up in all of this. Cyril Khan is basically a bottom-of-the-rung, civil worker convinced the Empire is up against a litany of terrorists and separatists and criminals. His own mother fully believes that the Gormans are using their status in the Democratic Senate, exploiting the democratic system to get away with things which nobody else would ever be allowed to. And these arrogant Gord need to be dealt with, damn the civil liberties. Dedra, an Imperial officer, grew up in an Imperial kinderblock and believes there is nothing worse than anarchy. The head writer, Tony Gilroy, goes out of his way to show how absorbed these characters are in the savior narrative themselves. Not just that the leader is saving the Empire, but they are doing their part in it. In one interview, Tony Gilroy speaks about how Cyril might have joined the rebellion in a different world, that he sought adventure and purpose to save something, to be the hero, to be part of something greater, and authoritarians actually offer people that sense too. The point I'm getting at here is that authoritarianism is deeply emotional. Don't just explore authoritarianism as police boots on the ground crushing dissent. Think of it as a social phenomenon, as part of a story we tell ourselves, as a view that develops of our society, of our nation. They sell it to people as responsibility, as justice, as sacrifice, as bravery, as change, as restoring something, taking your country back. While authoritarians do typically draw on fears and prejudice as well, those are disguised behind often a lot more positive feelings. And tactically, authoritarianism cloaks those deeply emotional prejudices and biases in more positive language so that we feel safe to engage with them. What I'm saying is, if you're gonna create stories and worlds like this, don't ignore how this happens internally, how this works on a very personal level. We get to be part of the savior narrative, and democracy and civil liberties almost become tangential to that. They're vague legal concepts and processes. They are bureaucracy that we're not particularly invested in. This can also be why it's so hard to dissuade friends and family out of authoritarian movements. It's not just a matter of personal values, but it becomes about identity. And behind all of this looms that big question: why do human rights matter if it led you to this? This is Nayib Bukele, this is Gilead, this is the Emperor, this is Viktor Orban, Duterte, and so many more. They prey on fear, selling the promise of safety and stability that, of course, only they can provide. No system can, no system will, you need the person. This is also why a fundamental part of the authoritarian narrative is the enemy. The globalists, the drug traffickers, the communists, the terrorists, the gangs, the rebellion, the separatists, the radical ideologues, the deep state. It doesn't really matter who it is, the point of it is the campaign against them. Different enemies are going to resonate in different cultural contexts, but as philosopher and activist Claude Lefort writes, the campaign against the enemy is feverish. The fever is good. It's the sign in the society of the evil to counteract. Enemies within are treated as the illness, and state violence becomes the fever, a necessary symptom of the body fighting to heal itself, to survive. And this terminology is actually something which Hungary's Viktor Orban has invoked very explicitly. A virus attack has been launched against us. The virus was developed in progressive liberal laboratories. The virus is attacking the most vulnerable point of the Western world, the nation. It is a nation-devouring virus that will atomize and pulverize our nations. Migration, gender, and woke. These are all just variants of the same virus. The aim of these is to destroy the national community. Only Hungarian illiberalism can provide a serum for the progressive virus. Orban positions himself and Hungary as David fighting Goliath, and has used that to concentrate power on himself, to undermine democratic norms in Hungary, to erode civil liberties over the last decade he's been in power. He is transparent here, that only his illiberalism can save the country and potentially the entire West. But this sort of language does something else you might have missed. It allows them to create a second category of identity or value through which they can sidestep democracy to question the legitimacy of whether their opponent should wield power at all. Do they represent Hungarian values? Are they a real Hungarian? The point is to question the legitimacy of democracy as a way to give people power and undermine the principles which underpin the system. But you'll also notice how poorly defined Orban's enemy is here. Quote, "These are all variants of the same virus," while describing three completely different things. This does two things. One, it means the enemy can change, agent or whatever Orban needs it to be to justify more power, and he does do that regularly, adding in different groups, taking them out as they're politically expedient. And 2, a broadly defined enemy justifies broad and vague powers to combat them. But the more interesting thing for me looking at all of this is the nature of the violence which follows this kind of rhetoric. Authoritarian violence and policy is disproportionate, and intentionally so. Andor actually recognizes this in a really interesting way, where when faced with the non-violent protest on Gore, the Empire sends in armed troops and specialized droid units to crush them violently, and in fact, it actually tried to manipulate Gormans into being more violent multiple times, and it repeatedly insisted to the rest of the world about how dangerous the Gore were. Why? To make the enemy seem more powerful and insidious than they really were, and in that, to justify more authoritarian tactics. They want you thinking, why else would they need to send in soldiers? They must be that bad. Authoritarians may take power with a crisis, but they actually want you to see the world as more dangerous and violent than it really is. They can never let the enemy seem weak or peaceful or even small. Every minor infraction has to be met with disproportionate violence. But there's also a bait and switch here, especially as the situation changes over time and they want to create the sense of ongoing crisis. Authoritarians will often connect real crises to artificial causes and their quote enemy. And this means that they often don't end up solving the problem because they're fundamentally just not approaching it correctly. This is a common pattern for a lot of authoritarian movements, but those who have a fascistic or religious streak to them are especially prone to it. Think about how that pattern plays out in your world, even before democracy falls, even before it really feels in danger. You can think of authoritarianism growing out of a whole set of other values which rear their head before democracy might ever fall. How do people start changing their thinking around police violence, around due process, around democracy as a whole, as hamstringing the government from doing what they need to do? How is this reflected in the language of politicians? Do they call due process bureaucracy? Violence can be an inherent disruptor to any democratic system because it's meant to give us a way to litigate our issues without violence. So seeing more and more of it in the news and the streets, hearing anecdotes from friends and family, this can be a direct challenge to the efficacy of the system as a whole to solve the problems in the first place. And authoritarians know this. Kill the idea and the institution follows. It decays with not only every iteration, but every impression of excessive violence. But you may have noticed something else about Orban's little tirade there. It is very ethno-nationalistic. Not every authoritarian draws on this sort of language, but it is very common for a reason. Anchoring themselves in an ethnic, religious, or cultural identity, often couched in some vision of the country being lost, or some utopian vision of the past, or a moral or civilizational decay, it ties the regime itself to something almost outside the democratic system, and something that may even paint democracy as a threat to, while gaining themselves a motivated voter base. Modi in India has attached himself to a Hindu nationalistic identity, Erdogan to Turkic Islam, famously converting the Hagia Sophia back into a mosque in 2020, and Orban to Christian Hungarian nationalism. Margaret Edwards-Gilead is an explicitly Christo-fascistic United States. I'm sure that you can think of many others around the world right now. Again, not every authoritarian movement is identitarian like this, but they often are, or they wed themselves to groups which are identitarian because they are dedicated voting bases. But the point is, I don't just want you to think about authoritarianism as like a set of government tactics. I want you to think about it as a sociological phenomenon in society. Ask yourself how the cultural and religious and social, lines are drawn through your world and how they can be monopolized for attention or power, how they can be manipulated to get people to no longer think in terms of rights and institutions and democracies and norms, but in terms of some bigger conflict at play of which they are inherently a part, something which transcends the democratic system and makes it into kind of like a vague process that doesn't really matter and isn't doing anything, especially because if it comes with some vision of the way the country is meant to be or it was in the past, then freedom itself can become the issue. Freedom took your country from you, and the conflation of all of these real issues with very personal value judgments and biases is kind of the point. If you can turn politics into an existential conflict, then democracy just becomes a tactic, and not all tactics are useful. Fundamentally, I want you to think of authoritarianism as a social environment first, as something which happens within a society before it ever rises into the levels of government, a set of norms and cultural shifts which set the stage for policy later. In a sense, authoritarian governments are only downstream of authoritarian social values. Though, I should be very clear, this is also a chicken and egg situation. Authoritarian policy can cause an authoritarian value shift, either because it's manipulated or because people see the policies in action and it causes them to think differently. The Overton window shifts. Authoritarians fluking into power can make them suddenly seem not taboo. They're integrated into the system and the system is noble. I talked before about how authoritarian violence is disproportionate, but I feel, and this is kind of my opinion, this is just something which I have been thinking and feeling about a lot. It's also vengeful. When you combine an enemy and a victim narrative with a fear of being under attack, state violence doesn't just become a solution, it becomes cathartic. To watch, to know it's happening, the feeling of an underdog finally fighting back. And this comes across in how the government frames and justifies this violence, and how people talk about this violence, and how the news portrays it. This is actually something that I feel The Handmaid's television show actually captures pretty well. The book is good for this as well, but it's very limited to offer its perspective. The show actually goes far beyond the book, and we get to see a lot more of Gilead society. And throughout it, we see so much violence, especially against women, and there's this vindication that commanders get from exploiting them and torturing them, these people that they feel victimized by, that they view as having personally destroyed their civilization. The justice system is focused on confession and guilt and intentional cruelty and admitting the state was right. In fact, the story goes out of its way to show those confessions far more than we ever see the actual violence. Not to mention the judicial system of Gilead is deeply punitive, not rehabilitative, another hallmark of authoritarian tactics. That vengeance comes through in the sense that these people must suffer and we shouldn't care about what happens to them. Studies have shown repeatedly that this is just not effective policy in the long term, but it does play well emotionally for certain demographics in a polarized social environment. This is also why authoritarians are obsessed with the death penalty, not because it's effective policy, but because it feels proactive, it feels decisive, and it lets them portray themselves as doing the necessary evil while their opponents are sympathizers, they're weak. Not to mention, it normalizes state violence and death as a mechanism of control, especially when the fantasy of strength is something a lot of voters fall for. Again, authoritarians try to portray themselves as these pragmatists, as people taking a realistic approach to a problem, but we see over and over just how emotional authoritarian movements are, how not pragmatic they are, especially in the long term. Their violence doesn't come down with the precision of a doctor with a scalpel, but of a drunk man chasing you with a baseball bat. Think about how authoritarians exploit the disproportionate and vengeful nature of their violence, and how this sets the stage for political changes down the line. A fact never started a war, never got police to torture people, never voted in a tyrant, never did away with due process. Only a story, a narrative, a feeling has that power. Democracy isn't just a system of voting, it relies on a free information environment, and this is why democratic backsliding often starts with eroding what are called diagonal safeguards. These are free media, free expression, free internet, free gathering, negative rights which underpin free elections and civil institutions in the exchange of information. When these weaken, so does our ability to know the facts, to see through the savior narrative, to understand the violence and crisis ourselves. Since Viktor Orban was elected as Hungary's prime minister in 2010, he's been steadily tightening control over the country's media. His early reforms created a central media authority with the power to fine or suspend independent media outlets. By 2018, nearly 500 media outlets were consolidated into a single pro-government foundation, giving Orban control over roughly half of Hungary's traditional media. In 2021, Hungary banned minors from accessing any information at all about the LGBT community, including in schools, in advertising and television, condemning queer kids to growing up in a hostile environment where finding any positive information about themselves is near impossible. In 2025, Orban signed a new law which functionally banned pride parades. Turkey has followed a similar path, monopolizing media airtime to quash the opposition, using state contracts and public advertising deals to give himself 60 times more the airtime than that of the opposition during the last election. And you might say, obviously it's for propaganda and to manufacture consent to their policies, and you would be right. And we see this as actually something pretty explicit that Andor tackles in how the government controls the narrative around the Gorman massacre.
With the right ideas, planted in the right markets, in the right sequence, we can now weaponize this galactic opinion.
But it's also about more than that. It's about scattering the opposition. Authoritarians want to make it harder to organize resistance against them by hiding other answers, explanations, and to prevent any coherent, cohesive opposition narrative from emerging. People like Orban and Erdogan not only want to position themselves as the only trustworthy source, but they want to give the impression that there is no real opposition, or what there is fractured and small, and siding with them is siding against the majority. One subplot I really loved in Andor is how Mon Mothma actually really struggles to get any meaningful message of resistance out. She asks explicitly about how anyone is meant to resist if they don't think anyone is with them. In 2077, the news feeds are constant, but they're controlled by powerful corporations in league with the government, and any opposition is prevented from getting much screen time. It gives the impression of open debate while never allowing the opposition to gain momentum. And all of this poisons the information environment. Today, in the real world, we're starting to see an emerging problem that LLMs and artificial intelligence are being used to propagate lies and propaganda on a scale that we've never seen before, faster than any human has in all of history. How on earth are we going to deal with that when so much of the internet is just wrong and it's filled with bots which we think are people but we can't verify, but they're being used to give the impression that everyone believes this or that or whatever. And we actually know that algorithms can reinforce autocratic regimes after what we saw in Myanmar, where the Facebook algorithm explicitly helped push the narrative of the enemy prior to the Rohingya genocide since 2016, with the deaths of dozens of thousands. Nobel Prize-winning journalist Maria Ressa argues in her book, How to Stand Up to a Dictator, that social media allows us to live in our own realities rather than a shared reality which is required to support democracy. Personalization says my reality is different from yours, and we can all have our own realities. But all these realities have to coexist in the public sphere. You can't tear us apart to the point that we don't agree on the facts. I cannot shake the feeling that the lack of a shared reality we're seeing emerge right now is contributing to the rise in authoritarian movements, especially because they're so often based on a lot of lies. Because if we can't agree on the facts, then that reduces everything down to opinion. And if everything is opinion, then all opinions are supposedly equal. And if all opinions are supposedly equal, then you can just dismiss the facts without much thought. And all of that means it is so much harder to convince people that these authoritarians are a danger to society and democracy in the first place. It is harder to send up those red flags. Authoritarians want you to be emotional. It is where they do their best. This is also why they attack the judiciary and journalists, to make people distrust them, these people whose kind of job it is to make sure that our solutions align with the facts, even if these institutions are not always perfect. Mon Mothma addresses this pretty explicitly in her speech, saying,
"Of all the things at risk, the loss of an objective reality is perhaps the most dangerous.
The death of truth is the ultimate victory of evil."
Just like we viewed authoritarianism as a product of a social environment and a value environment, authoritarianism can be viewed as a product of an information environment. Ask yourself how the information environment decays and sets the stage for authoritarian policies later, and how authoritarian policies poison the information environment. Which diagonal safeguards does the government target first? What is the most digestible way for people to curb the rights of others? How do they thrive in the information landscape before they seize power, and how do they manipulate it in their favor? I think it's easier to prevent ideas from ever taking root rather than dissuade people once they're exposed to them. And when it comes to their followers, it's easier to double down on an idea and convince yourself that you're right and that you're part of this big thing than to admit you've ever been fooled. Again, though, a chicken and egg situation. I do want to give credence to Andor for also showing, though, how a poorly controlled information environment actually can lead to the downfall of an autocratic regime as well.
Oppression is the mask of fear.
I'm assuming you've heard it before.
Bits and pieces.
Just keeps spreading, doesn't it?
Go check out my 3 videos on revolutions. This would have been a great video to put like a ground news sponsor on, but I don't have to do that because of you guys. Not only everyone on the Patreon, but those who have grabbed my books. If you find these videos helpful, talking about writing and world building, Well, I've actually got something even better for you, something I can actually fully get behind, my On Writing and Word Building series, which takes all of the writing and word building discussions we've had on this channel, videos like this, and puts them into these easy to read, easy to reference books with a ton of new detail, by the way, exclusive to only these books with better analysis and better examples, which I can only really do in these books, as opposed to videos where I'm worrying a lot more about like the algorithm and thumbnails and visuals and stuff like that. Over 100,000 of you guys have already picked up my books. It means a huge amount. And especially those who have given the reviews. Every one of these books covers different topics, so you can pick the one which fits you best. I, of course, recommend getting all three. But if you want to start, you can start on any of them, to be clear. They're completely independent of each other. I think Volume 3 is the best, but you can pick whichever one you want. But I am also a professional fiction writer. I've worked for games, I publish fiction, and if you want to grab my book as a catalog for the end of humanity, it's actually got a story in it about someone who basically does become a dictator. She's sort of puppeteered into becoming a godlike entity over a long time. I won't give you any more spoilers than that, but it's called, and I love this title, Trickle Down Lobotomies. I think that's just an incredible title. I'm not very good at titles normally, but I really, really love that one. All of these are available down the link in the description, and these are the best thing that I can offer you, that I can fully throw myself behind because I am promoting my own stuff, and I'm lucky that I am able to do that. And I don't have to take sponsors with every video. And thank you if you already have them. I will have a volume 4 coming eventually once I get home. There's a scene in Andor where Cassian is arrested over, well, basically nothing. He's sentenced to hard labor under the Public Safety Directive, his court case is expedited without legal representation, without appeal, barely a hearing, and little evidence beyond police testimony. It is almost comedic how absurd and quick it is, but it felt deliberate to me. Democracy does not die with one final dramatic stand. It decays slowly, invisibly, and in the places we do not wish to look. The reality for many on the fringes of society, the marginalized, the poor, the foreigners, and above all the criminals, our institutions fail for them a long time before the ordinary citizen ever realizes it. In fact, they may even vote for it. Too few care for the rights of criminals and too many are willing to write them off as deserving whatever they get anyway. But it's prisoners who first lose the right to vote, to live with dignity, to due process, and the only rights you truly have are the ones criminals do. The disproportionate and vengeful violence is always visited on criminals first, and on those the authoritarians want to label as criminals. They are the canaries in the coal mine of democracy. If you're creating a decaying democracy, then consider where it's decaying first. In the Philippines, drug users became easy targets for Duterte's campaign, with Duterte himself claiming they were less than human and needed to be executed, and it ended with a campaign of door-to-door raids against the country's poorest and thousands of extrajudicial killings. Likewise, one of Duterte's strongest critics, Senator Leila de Lima, was detained on trumped-up charges after she opened an investigation into those extrajudicial killings. The authoritarian focus on empowering law enforcement, on law and order, on harsher sentences, on attacking the judiciary, all of this allows them to easily dismiss opposition by either classing them as criminals or saying they're siding with criminals. My point is, if you're exploring a failing democracy, those diagonal safeguards fall here first. And critically, a lot of these changes are largely invisible to the population. They're sold as even positives, as taking action, but the ground they lay is for more repressive policies later. And to be clear, this stuff still happens in fully fledged democracies. There was a big issue in my home country in New Zealand about whether we should bring back something called a 3 strikes law, which is a harsher policing and sentencing initiative. My country is not in democratic decline, but it is in those policies that authoritarianism often hides. This is dry government policy about sentencing minimums and judicial oversight, but this is where authoritarianism grows. Consider looking at your authoritarian movement through the lens of prison reform, through the rights and entitlements of criminals and prisoners and arrestees, not just black boots marching on the halls of parliament and investing power in the supreme leader who cackles evilly for a time. Because for me, a lot of the time it's these sorts of policies which integrate a new kind of cruelty, of violence, a disdain for human rights into the supposedly democratic system. It normalizes this stuff and allows for more authoritarian policies down the track. And all of this is why it's so interesting that Andor goes out of its way to show how ordinary people turn a blind eye to this, that they allow it to happen. There's a great line from Marva, who's giving a speech imploring people to stand up and fight the Empire, where she says,
"We've been sleeping. We kept the trade lanes open and they left us alone. We took their money and ignored them. We kept their engines churning, and the moment they pulled away, we forgot them.
We've already talked about people who get swept up in that savior narrative, who believe in it, but even more importantly are those who turn the blind eye. They don't want to draw attention to themselves. They keep the trade lanes open. These are people who may even vote for the authoritarian on other policies, especially in polarized systems where there aren't many options. They vote to bring down the price of milk, of gas, and they refuse to see authoritarianism gnawing at the edges because it doesn't really affect them yet. Or worse, they just don't care. Especially because authoritarian tactics are typically only applied to specific areas of a government's policy. Crime, immigration, education, things like lowering the cost of living, safety, even free healthcare and education can still be achieved under authoritarian systems. They're not inherently incompatible. And authoritarians, I think, are very conscious of this. Like, maybe some of them delude themselves into thinking, no, actually everyone believes in what they're doing, but a lot of the time, they will try to pacify sections of the population with economic stimulus, even thinly veiled stability, so that their way of life gets tied up with the regime, with them remaining in power. This often happens with big spending promises near the election, especially because authoritarians do still have to manage the country. They still have to have a housing policy and a ministry of transport, and they can't just be let's torture criminals, They can't just be the let's put the kittens in the kitten grinder policy party. And all of those can be a Trojan horse for their other, more authoritarian policies, which maybe they know not to speak about, that they are strategic with, that they downplay to some people and upplay to others. If someone can convince themselves that democratic backsliding is just part of reality, that it's not something which they can really stop, it's just something which is happening, it's bigger than them, then they can almost put it out of their mind as a thing to necessarily worry about. If they make it a both sides thing, if they make it a fact of the economic situation at the moment, then they can convince themselves to turn a blind eye to it. Don't just think about how human rights die as a value in the minds of many, and don't just think about it as a product of a sociological or information environment, but how it's a product of apathy. Today's authoritarians are often elected legally, and then they slowly weaken democracy from within, without even fully getting rid of the institutions like the judiciary and parliament, what we can call horizontal safeguards, because they figured out a long time ago that keeping these institutions around actually lends a fog of legitimacy, and don't really matter if you can control them anyway. But what we do know is they exploit the laws of the system itself to neuter it, to make it ineffective, to encumber it with process and legalese, such that it ceases to exist. Andor actually has a really interesting example of this in its final episode. We see how the Empire controls who can speak through the Senate in a series of archaic and convoluted rules, and Mon Mothma basically has to make a bunch of backroom deals in order to be able to speak at all in the Senate, especially publicly, especially televised, and even then they try to shut off the newsfeed. Too often, we think of authoritarianism purely in terms of violence in the streets and curfews and crackdowns, but we've seen over the last 20 years just how much authoritarians abuse the rules of the system and weaponize subtle bureaucracy to maintain power. They undermine who can get into parliament with stringent rules and requirements. They neuter your voice through gerrymandering, which is basically changing electoral districts to manipulate who can win. We forget how much the impact of the actual system itself and how it's designed, how it's set up, controls who has power. What about how much advertising time the opposition is entitled to, or money? What about election campaign funding? How far in advance do you need to file to stand for election? Do they make it harder to vote by mail because they know the opposition gets more votes that way? Do they take away polling stations in the name of electoral integrity? Do they design the election system to bias certain kinds of winners? Like, this might sound illegal, but first past the post famously gives disproportionate power to just two parties. What about how judges are appointed or dismissed? Does the president now have the power to fire the chair of the Federal Reserve or all federal workers? How much evidence is required for a conviction? Do they make it so all questions of debate in Parliament have to be registered and vetted beforehand, so the government knows what's coming and can remove unfavorable ones? If you have a federal system, maybe the authoritarian movement realizes it's easier to control state legislatures than it is the federal one, so they intentionally weaken federal protection protections that safeguard against authoritarian policies and hand more power back to the states. This is interesting because it looks like decentralization when really it's just allowing the states to be the authoritarian policymakers. Bukele in El Salvador reduced the parliament from 84 to 60 seats, but it coincidentally removed mostly opposition seats. These reforms were even painted as saving democracy and, quote, making it fair. A while back, Viktor Orbán raised the number of constituencies a party would need to run candidates in before they could run in the election at all, which might sound uninteresting and ordinary and not that bad until you realize that in practice it makes it much harder for minor parties to compete at all, and it forces the country towards a two-party system where authoritarians often do quite well because they can package their authoritarian policies with genuinely popular and even rational and reasonable ones while not worrying about people splitting their vote away. This stuff isn't as interesting as boots in the street crushing protesters, but it is the way authoritarianism is codified into law without you realizing, the way it becomes entrenched. Because this stuff is monotonous and bureaucratic. And you'll also see how these rule changes often come with other justifications which at least seem reasonable on the surface. Oh, reducing the number of seats is about efficiency, reducing corruption. Changing which legislation gets considered is about ensuring the important bills come first. These changes set the stage for more authoritarian policies and make it harder to revert back. They create resistance to democratic change. But they also mean that when an authoritarian politician is criticized for being anti-democratic, they can sidestep this and they can just emphasize that they were elected, that the true democratic principle is them enacting the will of the people, which they claim that they are. In Brazil, Bolsonaro attempted to stay in power by disseminating false stories claiming the votes were rigged against him, simultaneously planning a coup and abusing the recount system and refusing to admit defeat. They abuse the system's rules to also destroy the people's faith in the institution itself while planning its literal destruction, knowing that the former will often suffer the impact of the latter even if they're found out, which is exactly what happened with Bolsonaro. He was arrested and imprisoned. Another way this manifests is in defying democratic norms. These are things which democratic systems kind of take for granted, conventions, things the government isn't meant to do or they're expected to do, but there's technically no law requiring it. Like, let's say the Prime Minister of Mobilopolis isn't meant to interfere with media companies which get some state funding, but they do in order to prop themselves up with good press. The aim of this, like with the erosion of diagonal safeguards, is the destruction of political pluralism. Pluralism is where multiple factions with different interests and priorities still work within the same government, either as coalitions or as appointees or even colleagues and so on. This too scatters the opposition and makes it harder for them to organize. This is typically combined with them undermining the separation of powers and the constitution, if your country has one. In Hungary, Orbán quickly began rewriting the existing constitution and then replaced it entirely with his own version. This new basic law was drafted and passed without any input from the other parties, earning it the nickname the One-Party Constitution. The Constitutional Court was then stripped of many of its powers to prevent new rulings and by consequence stopped it from being an effective check against the government. And all of this can often be framed as saving democracy. In fact, the reason that these movements often attack the judiciary is that the judiciary, rather than the legislature, is often the body which is standing in their way more. Quote, both legislative and judicial constraints, for example, are associated with a decreasing likelihood of experiencing democratic regression. Yet, once democratic regression is ongoing, only judicial constraints matter for averting democratic breakdown. This suggests that legislatures may be more affected during the early stages of democratic regression, to the point of being obsolete as bulwarks safeguarding democracy by the time the breakdown occurs. By contrast, judicial institutions may play an important role as democracy's last line of defense. I say this as someone with a law degree. The judiciary is often insulated from a lot of the populism and extreme political forces which easily pervade and permeate the legislature and executive, which changes a lot, changes very quickly, and are often working together very closely. Judicial independence is a vital principle of democracy to me. The result of constantly changing the rules to benefit themselves can create a managed democracy. This is the midway point between democracy and autocracy, where, yeah, you can vote and participate and possibly even freely, but it becomes increasingly difficult to affect real change. Maybe you've just adjusted to it. Some analysts have even labeled the United States as a managed democracy. The cyberpunk genre is full of these. In the cyberpunk series, the new United States emerges from a sort of civil war as technically a democracy, but with essentially only one real political party, the Federalists, who are heavily influenced by corporate interests. Companies like Militech hold significant sway over who gets elected, re-elected, what legislation is really passed. You can vote, but it's not going to matter. Media and these changes to the horizontal safeguards are used to manufacture consent for the government, and it makes people complacent. Maybe you can vote, but the actual rules of the system aren't really intended to reflect how the people vote, they're intended to reflect something else. Alternatively, in these transitional democracies, you might be able to vote for some change in policy, but not others. Housing policy might change from election to election, but nationalist education curriculums wouldn't. The end result is you still have a legislature, you still have elections, a judicial system, but the changes to the rules prevent them from being real checks on executive power, without having to openly destroy them. And this abuse of systems manifests in other ways too. The Prime Minister Momolopolis might not imprison a journalist, but they might pull government funding from their parent company under the excuse of budget reasons. They might only give government contracts out to those who seem loyal to the Prime Minister, creating a threatening business and community environment which makes people obedient without having to do anything. But something I've become increasingly aware of over the last decade is how all of this just numbs us to authoritarianism. That's the thing. These people want us to feel that these tactics are normal, that what they're doing is unremarkable, that it's just part of it. Do enough of it, see it never stopped, and it's hard to care. It's hard to think that it can be stopped. Broad, nebulous powers allows the authoritarians to say, I have the power to do this, right? And it all gets caught up in argument. It all gets caught up in, well, maybe they could, maybe they couldn't. And people forget. And they move on, and then there's the next thing, which just makes it worse and worse and worse. Too often, we're told that it can't be authoritarian because it's legal, and that to me kind of misses the point of like what we're fighting against here, that it is within their power. Disco Elysium is set after a failed revolution in Revachol, where the Coalition of Nations, a pseudo-authoritarian government which prevents self-determination and controls Revachol's resources, basically neuters any real opposition. But a real undercurrent in the game is just how little people care anymore about politics, that they're just numb to this authoritarian rule, to the utter decay of their own society. They can't do anything to change it, they can't vote it away, the revolution failed, the atmosphere is somber. The world is poor and broken, the coalition is just so much bigger than them. Many people don't even really seem to be aware of everything that's going on, and so you come to them and you tell them about it and they just go, oh yeah, I guess I'm just gonna keep trying to do my own thing. It's just sad. In one interview, one of the creators spoke directly to this and saying, there's another interesting topic, one I've noticed in post-Soviet countries and that I've heard is similar in China. Authoritarian governments cause young people to lose interest in politics, which implies the dangerous outcome in which one says, politics is for someone else. I can change so little, I might as well become disinterested. This came out of the post-Soviet years and it's still affected the Estonian youth. I spoke before about those who get swept up in the movement and those who turn a blind eye. But there is a third player in all of this, and that is that the non-authoritarian, the democratic factions in these stories, in these worlds, in these countries, fail to get their shit together. When we grow up inside these systems, we don't realize how fragile they are. We assume that they'll, eventually right themselves. Mon Mothma is that optimistic Democrat. She still believes that if the Senate just voted to get rid of Palpatine's powers, the nightmare would be over. And Tarak is realizing that actually it's already too late. Democracy is already dead, especially because these factions often aren't willing to play dirty like an authoritarian, and they're unwilling to work together with more radical factions. There is a nobility to the democratic process that people are reluctant to let go of, that they are reluctant to believe can even die.
They're lost! All of them lost!
But there is another world-building detail, which I've kind of hinted at throughout the video, but I want to say very explicitly. Complex institutions take a long time to undermine and finally die. The authoritarianism that we've seen emerging over the last decade hasn't been able to completely overthrow democracy. It's been able to weaken it. Instead, they chip away at the safeguards bit by bit, at the foundations, so that it sets the stage for something further down the line. Sometimes it's not the charismatic leader who talks about wanting to be a dictator that you need to worry about, but the person who comes after once those institutions have decayed. There's this temptation to kind of see that charismatic leader kind of be pushed off and not win elections and go, whew, well, glad that's over. But when they're poisoning the information environment, when they're chipping away at those safeguards, what we're doing is setting the stage for someone else to take advantage of that later if we don't rebuild these institutions. Ask yourself, which factions failed to act quickly enough? What happens to them when these authoritarians rise to power? At what point is democracy beyond saving, and why could they not get their act together in time? Don't focus on that single moment where power is vested in the dictator. Ask yourself how the environment came to be where it was possible for this to happen in the first place. Why didn't the courts strike them down? How did they even get the votes to do this in the first place? Why didn't the media see it coming, and why didn't the people rise up against them? When I was in the car with that guy from El Salvador, I asked him if he was worried about Bukele destroying democracy after the stuff that he had done. And he said, well, he still has to win next time, so I'm not that worried. This baffled me because, to me, Bukele was obviously stacking the deck against any other, person beating him. I couldn't shake the feeling that, like too many ailing democracies, he had too much faith in his institutions in a sense. The problem is that democracies are not perfect. Sometimes they are corrupt, sometimes they have flaws, gerrymandering does underrepresent voters, and the authoritarian will often exploit these flaws to do away with the system entirely. Consider how broken your democracy might already be, and how those cracks lay the foundation for the authoritarian to rise to power and get people to stop caring about democracy as a whole. The irony, of course, is that authoritarians are very often corrupt, but prosecuting them only hardens their victim narrative. Not to say we shouldn't do it, but that conventional democratic problem-solving mechanisms are not sufficient to undo the social and informational environment which allowed them to happen. None of this is to say democracy is the same thing as automatically good government. Often it's slow and inefficient. It is possible for a country to be both very democratic but also deeply cruel and violent to criminals or their enemies. But democracy's base assumptions and institutions just don't vibe as well with authoritarian tactics, which is why movements who want to use them often end up targeting democracy itself, whether they admit it or not. But the final step is taking down the vertical safeguards. These are the free and fair elections. In a sense, they're already gone. In a sense, we've already lost free and fair elections. How do you have free and fair elections without strong horizontal or diagonal safeguards? There's no single pattern, I should say. All of these three things happen kind of at the same time, and they feed into each other, and they're going to happen differently depending on your world and your story that you are creating. Different cultural environments and tensions and conflicts and crises are going to allow for certain kinds of policies to thrive or get passed more easily. But that's how eventually you get to Kim Jong-un winning 99% of the vote. Let's go back to Momolopolis. Exploiting a decade of crises, your party takes power with promises to save the nation. You decry the criminal gangs and refugees as a source of a country's problems, and you send the military into the cities run by the opposition, which you're not really legally meant to do, but it's all to make it seem like the opposition isn't taking real care of the country, but you are. You build prisons and empower the police. You erode judicial independence by mandating sentencing minimums for small crimes. You cast doubt on judicial independence and rulings, eventually removing their ability to rule against the state in constitutional matters. They are unelected bureaucrats, you say. Slowly, you gerrymander your opposition away into oblivion, and you paint your electoral victories as proof of your popularity, then reduce the number of polling stations in certain cities in the name of efficacy, knowing where the opposition party is really based. Finally, you fix the constitution to allow you to be re-elected, and even though the people can vote, they cannot really throw you out. We've spoken a lot about authoritarianism as a sociological phenomenon, as a product of an information environment, as an invisible decay in institutions often felt by the marginalized first, before we ever see boots in the street. But I also want to talk about something else. There is this desire to make the authoritarians seem cool and efficient. Like, this comes from, you've probably seen the memes of like how the Nazis had the best uniforms and how the empire looks sleek and stunning and shiny, right? They look cool in a sense. But don't fall into the trap of imagining authoritarians as these upstanding, imposing, especially masculine figures. Almost always, these people are deeply obsessed with their own ego, focused on the wrong problems, and their solutions are childish, emotional, and disconnected from the facts of reality. Their understanding of the world and history is often simplistic, and this is actually why I really loved director Krennic as a character in Andor.
We stand here amidst my achievement, not yours!
He is a petulant child given too much power. He builds the Death Star not because it's an efficient show of force, but because it's a show of power, of arrogance, of his pride and power. And that's the thing, authoritarianism is inefficient, it is self-destructive, it is a shortcut a lot of the time, especially as it becomes more and more fascistic. Repression is the tool of lazy leadership. Democratic institutions take a long time to build and can be slower and less efficient because power is voluntarily dispersed. But that is also its virtue. Authoritarianism turns on itself because when there is no enemy defined, when failure inevitably finds them, they can never take the blame themselves. They pass it on to someone else. It's not Cassian who ends up in prison at the end, it's Dedra. It's not a rebel who kills Krennic, but Tarkin. Eventually, they always eat their young, and they're old. The seeds of their destruction are sowed in the way they begin. The fever kills the body. This is not me saying you do not need to worry. All around the world, more and more countries are slipping into authoritarianism, and too many of us are happy to just keep the trade lanes open. It might be your country today, it might be your country tomorrow. Authoritarianism on this scale is not normal. It is not a matter of opinion. If you see these patterns playing out in your home, you need to resist them. Don't let your friends and your family fall down that rabbit hole. Those are the people you can reach most easily. Don't let them be bystanders, and don't be a bystander. Don't just vote to keep the trade lanes open when there are far greater things at stake here. Right now, the most powerful country on the planet is slipping deeper and deeper into authoritarianism, and it has been for years. And other countries are sure to follow as they adapt to its policies, its politics, and echo its influence. Our institutions are not invincible. Do not make the mistake of thinking they are, that they will just protect themselves without you. They fall without people to defend them. Because here's the reality. Convictions are always transactional. You always pay with blood. The only real question is whether you bleed for your own convictions or you wait too long and bleed out for those of the tyrants.